Welcome to The One Inside, an internal family systems podcast. I'm your host, Tammy Sollenberger. I'm excited that you and all of your parts have taken time to be with me and all of my parts. If you are a coach, a client, a therapist, if you are in business or education, and you're curious about the IFS model, you are in the right place. Now, let's see what happens on today's podcast. Hey everyone. On today's episode, I speak with Dr. Ed Yeats. Ed is a well-known speaker. He's been at the IFS conference. He has a day-long workshop that he said fills up every year on IFS and Shamanism. He's just like the go-to guy on this conversation, I feel like. So I'm super excited to talk to him today. So basically what happens, this is a long one, so I appreciate you starting to listen because I'm sure you looked at the time and was like, oh my gosh. But so what I did was I wrote an outline on the show notes so you can see what are the kind of the topics and just a little bit of an outline. But basically we talk for the first hour about IFS as a form of shamanic healing. And then for the last 20-ish minutes, we talk briefly about parallels between IFS and Buddhism. And there's lots of things in between. So you can see that on the outline. But the thing, I called this IFS and attunement and synchronicity because I feel like that's the common thread between the whole conversation we have. It just keeps coming up over and over again. And I really played with the idea of separating this into 2 episodes because I thought maybe you would listen to it if it was 2 shorter episodes, but it was just really hard to figure out like where to separate it. And then also it just all goes together really, really well. So I didn't separate it. So there we go. That's today's with Dr. Ed Yeats. And so I just want to give you a little bit of a heads up. It's the end of June. And so we've got this one. And then in July, I'm still working with Duran Young to bring 4 episodes for Minority Mental Health Awareness Month. Duran and I have already done one, and that will be released on July 10th. And we're still working together to get just to organize the other 3. But so you'll at least have one, but hopefully you'll have 4 episodes in July with Duran and I and another guest. So it'll be the 3 of us in July. And then in August, I am only going to give you one. It's one that I've already done before. I mean, I've already recorded the episode, and it's a good one, and it's not with Dick, but it's with another really big name, and it's a he, and it was great, and I loved him, and you guys are going to love him too, and that's the only one I'm going to do in August. I'm taking a break from recording in August, so I'm just going to give you that one in August, and then we'll be back full-blown in September. These have turned out to be weekly. It was never my intention to do these every week as I have a full private practice and a family. So I'm going to try to go back to every other week. That's the plan. But I have other parts of me that love doing this and keep scheduling. I have like an inner scheduler that keeps scheduling them. And then and then there's another part of me is like, but when are you going to fit that in? So anyways, I just want to give you a heads up about what's happening. Sorry, I'm giving you a long introduction to add to this long episode, but I hope everyone's doing really well. Take care. Enjoy this one. How are you this morning?
I'm well. I'm pumped. I'm psyched for this.
Oh, good. I'm too. Me too. Yeah. So if you were to look out a window, tell me what you would see and tell everybody where you are.
Before looking out a window, I would encourage you to just have a look right here in this space that I've been occupying for the last 40 years.
It's beautiful.
Many, many healings have happened in this space. You can see my meditation cushion probably right there.
Oh, yeah.
And then the seats that my clients sit in back there.
So what I would describe to everyone is Ed has these incredible like reclining seats. He's got a beautiful rug that's kind of a pink fuchsia color. And on top of that is these two tall seats. And you know what my eye goes to are the beautiful plants you have behind you.
Yeah, there are some nice plants. I just watered them actually, because I always do that on Sunday, but I was away yesterday. Also, if you look on the mantelpiece, you'll see two Muppets, Statler and Waldorf. They're the grouchy old guys on the Muppets that used to hang out in the balcony and
Yeah, in a theater balcony, right?
make grouchy comments. I often will suggest that parts that are skeptical can hang out with them.
Oh,
They are
good.
sitting on either side of a massive amethyst point, and that which is a great absorber of negative energies. So everybody feels better after they've been hanging out over there.
Wow, even the grumpy critics.
Yes, if they
Wow.
want to. It's always entirely up to them if that's where they want to hang out.
I
So
like it. That's
I just
great.
thought, yeah, talking about that, that's the indoor environment. And
do you have a guitar behind you?
yeah, well, there's a guitar. There's a guitar that you can't see, which is the one I practice on. And there's another one in the corner. I was a small time folk singer back in the late 70s.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
I actually sang on the stage of the Gaslight Cafe on
Wow.
amateur night once and played 3 songs. But I'm talking to you from Newton, Massachusetts, in an old gray colonial house that where I've lived for the last 40 years or so. Even though it's a suburb, there's a lot of green and everything is blooming.
Yes.
So
Finally, yes.
yeah, all the azaleas are bright, and pretty much all the trees are leafed out. Even the oaks are coming along. This is a particularly nice place. It's kind of sitting on top of a hill in a relatively quiet spot.
Oh, nice.
When the landscapers aren't going in the summer, it's a dead end street, but that doesn't stop people from driving up the street, turning around and driving back down all the time. That's a lot less happening now during the pandemic than it was, but it will be happening more, I'm sure, soon. The other thing I would want to point out is that if you were here, I would encourage you to visit a great old white oak tree, which has been here for easily 350 years, which is a deeply appreciated teacher of mine, and a real kind of amazing being. Certainly the width of this room.
Wow.
And you can, I think, get eight men around it with their arms like this, hand to hand. 6 or 8, I can't remember the last time we did it, but it's a great old oak.
Wow. Can you talk a little bit about how that oak is your teacher?
I was, in the first place, hesitant to live in I'm sort of a country boy at heart and wanted to go back to the country. But my wife felt very strongly that she wanted to live someplace where our kids would have good schools and wouldn't be isolated. And she was right about that, looking back on it. And so when we saw this house, there was something about the age and the sort of character of this house that I loved. But then when I saw the tree, it was kind of like, oh, absolutely, I'll live here. Because it was just such a marvelous being. I didn't even realize it at that point that that tree would become a teacher of mine. But it's really played a role in my shamanic education, which we can get into.
Yeah, I like that.
and more depth. But I'm the sort of person who has learned how to tune into the, it really is kind of like learning to tune into a station on the radio that you previously just didn't realize you had an antenna for.
Wow.
And this gets into the whole question of how to connect with guides, and how to. But if you're an IFS therapist, which probably most everybody listening is, then you have some already developed intuitive skills, so that when people are in self and are actually inside and relating to their parts, they have entered a kind of shamanic space. So if you tune in to that and can tell when they are and when they aren't, and when you are and when you aren't, then you are in the process of tuning into the stations on the radio that most people just don't know exist, where it's possible to relate to the unseen world, I guess is what I would say. And it's not a big step to go from there to having a conversation with the tree, or for that matter, in my case, to go from having a conversation with a tree to go to have a conversation with a part or with a guide. It's the same. It's really the same thing. It's the same attunement, I guess would be the right word. So I could tell you one story about this, my relationship with this tree. And this is before I discovered IFS. There was this point at which I was just really in a state of despair. I don't remember what the content was, but I just was feeling profoundly wounded and in a state of despair. And like I was sort of unsavable, I guess would be a way of putting it. Even though I had at that point, I'm sure, some experiences of feeling saved in some deep way. My parts were not healed, and so I don't know what was going on exactly. But I was walking up our driveway, which then was just gravel, and then walking up past the tree, and the tree said, "Come here." I had learned at that point by then that when you get an invitation like that, you don't just keep walking. So I walked over to the tree, and I had previously done a lot of kind of leaning against the tree and getting to know its energy and sort of merging with its energy and letting it help me drain negative energies out through my feet into its roots, into the ground, that kind of thing. And trees can be incredibly helpful if you have their permission that way. That's one of the things I teach when I teach shamanic, the introduction to shamanism, which I've done many, many, many times. Little workshops with people to introduce them to shamanic practice. But in any case, so I'm walking. I walk to the tree, and it says, "Keep walking," and it's directing me to walk all the way around it. So I just followed the instructions, and then it said, "Stop." So I stopped, and it said, "Look down." And there was this rock, big rock, really big rock. It said, "Sit down." Okay, so I sat down. I sat down on the rock. It said, "All right, look up." And I looked up. What I saw immediately was this enormous place where a huge limb, a limb the size of the biggest tree you've probably seen in a long time, had been cut off. And I had heard stories that this tree had a limb that like went out in that direction a long way, and that kids would play on it and stuff. But at some point, I guess it must have either fallen off and then been trimmed or been cut off. And there were lots of other places on the tree that had clearly, similarly had been pruned or cleaned up or whatever. And the tree, after I saw that, I sort of knew, but also the tree said, I'm an oak tree. I've lost limbs like that, but I'm still an oak tree. And it was like very fully alive. You could see that if you just looked at its head of hair, if you will. It was very, very vibrantly an oak tree in a beautiful way. And that was the teaching. That's a good example of a nature teaching, what in shamanism is called direct revelation.
Wow. Well, and I can get that if you're not tuned into that, or if you're walking, if you're tuned into the busyness in your head, or you're
Yeah,
tuned into what you have to do next, that you're not even tuning in to what that oak tree, the message of the oak tree.
right. Yeah. I mean, that was the fruit of a long process and a developed relationship.
Well, right. I was just thinking that too, that like you had already built a relationship with that tree, just like
Right,
we build a relationship with our parts. And the more we build a relationship with them and they feel us, then
right.
the more we can attune to them.
That's right. It's really true. So you seem to be getting it, that it's the same capacity. We're really talking about accessing self, actually,
Yeah.
and not, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, and I was surprised enough by the invitation that I think my despairing parts just kind of like stepped back for a moment, and I just followed what I was
Mm,
being shown,
mm,
and it was very comforting to me to see that that was true, that I could be alive and vibrant, that that was a possibility, at least for this tree. If not,
mm.
if I didn't feel that way, I still don't feel that way 100%, but I do feel that way sometimes.
Right. Right.
I think the tree's like that most of the time.
Can we back up and talk about your
Yeah,
story?
sure.
And I don't know if you want to talk about your like how you came to find out about IFS and then how
Hmm.
you came to find out about shamanism, or if they're parallel or if that's the same story.
It's more sequential.
Okay.
I guess one way I'd put it is that I think for each of us, there's like a certain amount, anyone anyway, that has kind of a spiritual orientation of any kind, um, is part seeker and part finder.
Mm,
And there was a point for the first 50 years, I'm going to be 70 in September. For the first 50 years, I was primarily a seeker, starting out as a Quaker. And everybody's a seeker the whole way through.
mm,
So it's not like you stop being a seeker ever. Maybe there's a point with some people where they find it so deeply that they're no longer seeking.
mm,
I could see that possibility from what I found, but I think around when I was around when I was 50, which were a couple of years before that, uh, I started having a shift from being a seeker to a finder. And the first thing I found uh, that really stands out is a book that I'm not sure exactly where it came from, but it was in the back of my Jeep. I would drove a Jeep at the time, and I used to go up to a place called Grace Pond in northern Maine for a week by myself. And I would fly fish and walk and meditate and just see more moose than people in the course of a week. I'm a naturally kind of a contemplative, so that was a natural thing for me to do. And this book was there. And so I don't know if you've ever done this, but sometimes when I read the newspaper, I read like the very end of it, of a story, and then I sort of keep reading backwards. And then by the time I'm done poking around, I've read the whole thing, but I didn't read it from beginning to end. Something like that happened with that book. It was a book called Soul Retrieval by Sandra Ingerman, who is actually a very highly renowned shamanic teacher in what you might call the core shamanic tradition, American shamanism. This is a concept coined by Michael Harner, who passed away a couple of years ago. But he sort of made shamanism. He did for shamanism what John Kabat-Zinn did for mindfulness. In a way, he sort of made it locally sourced, if you will. So anyway, I think at that point, I was just really fascinated by the idea of soul retrieval, by the idea that it could be possible to retrieve lost parts of ourselves. And that from the shamanic standpoint, you need a shaman to do that for you. And she was describing how she did that and cases of that and the sort of shamanic viewpoint. I wrote a fan letter to her. It was a very Zen fan letter. You know, I loved your book. It changed my life. I hope someday I meet you. Just that. And she wrote back saying, thank you very much.
What?
I hope I meet you too
Oh my
sometime.
gosh, wow.
So I signed, she was gonna offer a workshop in New York. No, she was gonna offer a local workshop, which was undersubscribed, so it was canceled. And I had been signed up for it. I think I wrote to her and said, I was signed up for your workshop, but it was canceled, so I don't know what to do. And she called me.
Wow.
And she said, well, I'm going to do one in New York, but it happened to be on my son's birthday, so I couldn't do that. And I said, well, since I have you on the phone, I wonder if you would do a soul retrieval for me.
Oh my gosh.
And she said, well, why don't you think about it for a month? And then if you still want to do it, write to me. So I didn't really need to think about it for a month.
No, I know. I wonder why she asked you to do that. You're like, yeah.
But I waited a month dutifully, and then I wrote to her and said, well, I've thought about it, and I really like to do it. And that actually, now looking back on it, I had firefighter parts that really didn't want that to happen. So I had some backlash against that. But I did end up in Santa Fe, New Mexico, in her little Kiva room where she does her healings. And I had an afternoon of shamanic healing. And she retrieved 3 soul parts for me, along with several power animals, and did a whole bunch of what they call extraction work, which is clearing out negative energies from my body.
Can I ask some questions?
Sure.
Okay. So
yes, you may.
Our soul. So, okay, when I think of soul, I think of having like one soul. And I'm guessing it means, so this is meaning something different. This is more about like
right.
when we think of hearts.
Yeah.
So tell me about
this
that.
This is how I first encountered the whole idea of parts.
Okay.
And after reading that book, it started showing up in my therapies too, that people would have spontaneous soul return experiences where they would witness or have revealed to them parts of them that had, from a shamanic standpoint, soul loss is the result of a trauma or major illness or an accident or a sudden loss or shock to the system, where someone's sort of like not the same after.
Okay.
And the idea is that it's a loss of your vital essence, that some of your vital essence has been lost.
Okay.
And it correlates real well with the idea of dissociation. that, when people, or exiling of parts, so when something traumatic enough happens, then a part has to like go into someplace else to, and this is from a shamanic perspective, it's viewed as a sort of protective thing for the whole system, for that part to go, and you learn in shamanic training how to go and find them and bring them back, find them, witness them, bring them back, blow them into the person's heart, and then tell them the story of what happened. And I've probably done 100 soul retrievals, and some, many of them have been, most of them have been really, I'll come back and tell the story, and the person will like recognize that something happened to them when they were 4 or when they were 8 or whatever. And I'll describe a scene that I saw in the journey that I did, and they'll recognize that scene. But what wasn't there at that time was anything about what you do to integrate parts that have been retrieved. And you only do soul retrievals really for somebody who knows enough about shamanism not to be freaked out by drums and rattles and sage and stuff like that. So,
can I ask another question?
Sure.
So so it sounds really similar to IFS, which I know we're going to talk about,
Yeah.
but what you said was very different, that you're seeing their selves or their stories, like you're
Right.
part of their stories. Can you tell me about that?
Well, what are you curious about?
Like, so when I'm thinking of, if I'm working with a client and doing IFS and they're telling me like their self is witnessing their exile. So they're
Right.
saying, I was 4 and I was in the kitchen and my mom hit me over the head with a pan. I don't know why I'm thinking that, but
Right.
so I'm not actually seeing that. Like I'm imagining it because they're telling me it, but I'm not in the story.
But you can kind of see it sometimes, can't you?
I can because I'm super visual. So I
Right.
sometimes do imagine that.
Right. And yeah, I've had that happen before I knew anything about IFS. People would tell me about their memories, and sometimes I would kind of know where in the kitchen it happened, and I wouldn't say that or point anything out. I just
Right.
could kind of see it as the person is telling me the
Well,
story.
and is that part of the
So
attunement that you talk about? Is like I'm attuning to that signal?
I guess so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I bet that happens with you and with your clients when they're deeply in and you're deeply in with them.
Yeah.
That you're not just imagining it. Imagination is sort of that's the pathway in a way for all of this.
Well, I think that sounds like what happened with the shamanism, It sounds like there's this, from my super limited understanding, is that
Yeah.
is like we're entering this other realm or these other energies and we're kind of in it together. Is
Right.
that what that means? Is we're kind of in it together, like when we're like that IFS is a pathway to shamanism or something like that, that it's like I'm tuned into that energy with them together.
Yeah. Yeah. Actually, I view it as a form of shamanic healing, IFS.
Yes.
And and I've gotten no argument against that from Dick and other people.
Because there's so many, right? Because that's what you're saying is when when a client or when I'm with my parts, when I'm in self and witnessing a part, then I am in that other realm or I'm in that different energy. I'm experiencing that. And that's a
Yeah.
form of shamanism.
Yeah. You're entering into what the Aborigines in Australia call the everyone, or the dream time is another word for it. Carlos Castaneda called it the shamanic state of consciousness.
Mm.
But that's where healing happens. This sort of healing happens in that
Mm.
sort of imaginal realm, you could call it,
Yeah,
and
right. Because it does
the
seem like
dream world.
right, because we're using our imagination, but we know it's not just our imagination. Like, and
Right,
sometimes I'll even say to my clients, like, it's kind of like your imagination, and then they sometimes get it, but we know it's not just
right.
something else is happening.
It's real. It feels real.
Yeah, yeah.
It is real.
You read this book that just mysteriously shows up in your Jeep at the same time that you're on this amazing retreat,
Mhm.
and then you become best friends with this woman that writes this book.
Well, not really. She was destined to like really make a mark, really make a difference in the world. So she's trained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of shamanic teachers at this point. And she's one of those people when they have like, she's on the circuit when they have, you know, uh, when they have Sounds True has a thing that includes shamanism. She'd be one of
She's the one.
the
Yeah.
big, the big shots. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I didn't actually become friends with her so much as I got to have an afternoon with her, and then I did study with her after that. Some I trained under her a little bit for a couple of weeks, which was a totally life changing experience.
Mm.
It's kind of shamanic boot camp. Um, hmm?
God. Do you want to say something about how it was life changing?
um, well, I just had experiences there that were unexplainable, and that I learned, and that uh, were the sorts of things that you read about, like the experience of no separation, for example.
Mm.
After about a week and a half, I was in that kind of a state, no separation.
Mm.
Um, and they taught us step by step uh, a whole series of healing methods. And at the same time, there was one level of initiation after another. So by the end, everybody was just like wide open. It was just really something. It was
Mm.
really marvelous, kind of living the dream experience for me at that time, which is 20 years ago.
Hmm. And then you came home, and did you have like practices that you did after that, or how did you kind of integrate that amazing experience into your day-to-day life?
Well, I made friends with a woman who's now also an IFS therapist, and who taught with me for about a decade. And the two of us started doing introductory workshops
Hmm.
and stuff. And then what we call deepening workshops to introduce people to power animals. And we even did a workshop that is the pattern of which is the same as the intention and transformation workshop that I and a team of people have offered at the IFS conference for the last 6 years.
So were you already an IFS therapist when you went to?
No,
Okay.
no, I resisted that as much as I could. All of my colleagues were getting trained in IFS, and I was thinking, well, I already know how to do soul retrievals. It's just that it wasn't integrated. Like I had my shamanic practice, and there was some overlap between my shamanic practice and my psychotherapy practice. But
Mm.
my psychotherapy practice was pretty much narrative, relational stuff, rather
Mm.
than um, and so I finally reached the point where it's sort of like I couldn't. I've often said to Dick, resistance is futile. It's like out of what is that? Out of Star Trek. Um, IFS is just there's no point. After a while, you just can't help loving it if you get exposed to it. Um, so I wanted to get exposed to it, and I went to a day-long thing that was really just probably a 4-hour thing where Dick that Dick offered somewhere near here in Massachusetts. And I got a friend of mine to go with me. I remember when I first met him, it was in the men's room, actually. He was in the next urinal. And I turned to him and I said, one of my teachers is in your index. Because I guess I had the book, one of the books. And he said, who? And I said, Sandy Ingerman. And he said, oh, yeah, we have guides and all that stuff. And then that was that. That was the first time I ever met Dick Schwartz. But
were you surprised that he was like, oh, yeah, we have guides? And he was, because that's the thing that,
made me feel welcomed.
Yeah, oh, good.
It really did.
Good.
Yeah. And then he proceeded to show a demo that most everybody has probably seen called Trauma Behind Rage, which is the Vietnam vet. And that was very moving, very profound to see it in action. And I was sold at that point. I just looked for a level 1 to sign up for.
Yeah.
That was that.
So can I back you up again?
Sure.
You mentioned power animals.
Yes.
Can we talk about what that is?
Well, sure. Power animals are a form of guide, one sort of category of guides that have particularly to do with the body and with your health, and it's timely for your immune system, and it's said from a shamanic perspective that you wouldn't survive childhood if you didn't have power animals. They're guardian spirits. They're spirits whose job it is to protect you, and to and they're, you might call them sort of major league teddy bears. They're sort of like, they're a lot like what Winnicott called transitional objects. They're a lot like that. So they're a great source of comfort and a great source of sort of attachment security, in that they're there for you, and that's the deal is they get to participate in embodied life, and and you get to share their power. And if so that's a little about power animals.
So to ask kind of the first question, which is, how do you know? So I heard Dick say that we all have guides.
Yeah.
So how do you know, like, if you have a guide, or what your guide looks like, or who your power animal is, or what your power animal is?
Well, people, if you look at a totem pole, that's probably somebody's power animals, because they sort of end up lining up sort of at the different energy levels of the body, the chakras. So chances are you got, unknown to you, you have quite a few power animals. But so it would be a project to get to know them all, in the same way that it's a project to get to know your parts. But power animals are wonderful helpers, and that don't have an agenda or control issues or any of that. So they don't have burdens. That's really a great aspect of who they are. One way, if you look around your house, and and you have lots of little statues of frogs or fish or bunnies or something like that, chances are, if there's one in particular that when people who know you will like just want to give you something special, they'll give you with my wife, it's giraffes. People who love her give her giraffes. And she's much more interested in the stock market than she is in power animals. But she's, I think, at this point, accepted that the giraffe is one of her power animals. She couldn't live with me without recognizing that. But right,
I
so
love that. So you're just naturally drawn to that. That's so interesting that it's not something that's going to be like, oh, it's something completely alien to you. It's like, just look around. What are you just organically drawn to?
that's right. That's true.
Mm.
That's really true.
Well, and I like that idea of they're like parts, and that we need to get to, I don't know if we need to but we need to get to know them, or we are invited to get to know them.
Right. Yeah. And it's not really hard. Once you have the intention, it's not really hard. Um, and if you have the intention and you start walking a path like that, it's not really hard. They will show up.
Yeah.
They'll show up. It's what you'll start to have, what they call synchronicities, not coincidences, but synchronicities. So that if you, after this conversation, you may find that there's some animal that you've got that is around your house, and then later you might run it, a truck might go by with that on the side, and you start to become, it's sort of like when you're thinking about buying a car.
Yeah.
You start seeing the car that you want to buy, it's going by all the time.
Yeah. It's so weird when that happens.
It is quite something. I mean, that's happened to me many times, synchronicities like that.
Yeah.
Particularly when I'm doing shamanic work. If I do, like, one shamanic healing method is called power animal retrieval, and it's a healing that's done for someone who's lost their power. So maybe they lost their job, they had a car accident, they had a whole series of bad luck. Their marriage broke up. They had an illness, all those things, and they're sort of really, that's called power loss. And the cure for that, or something that can be done, is someone who has a shamanic training could go into the spirit world and ask for an animal to come back to this person, and then do the same thing as you do with a soul retrieval, blow it into their heart. That's really such a sweet thing to do, because when I was trained, I found a place where I could find power animals for people and bring it back and tell, you get to know the animal and get it to tell a story about why it's coming back for that person at this time. And the less you know about what's really going on in the person's life, the better, because you just tell the story and they go, oh, yeah. Wow.
So I think that's what I mean. That sounds a little bit different, is that you go to, like, as the shaman,
right,
you're going to the room to find their animal and then blow it into them.
Yeah.
Into
And
their heart.
I remember finding that very touching. The very idea that there was such a thing as compassionate spirits, that in this world there were compassionate spirits that are looking out for us and want to help us if we would tune into them. That could just about bring tears to my eyes right now. And then the fact that there are people who are willing to go into the spirit world with all of what that means in order to be an intermediary, that also is very touching. Such an act of love to go through whatever you have to go through in order to train to be able to do that. All that sounded really beautiful to me, and still does. But you're right, there is a big difference in IFS. That's a perfectly, like, that approach is a perfectly wonderful approach from an indigenous culture standpoint, where, I mean, there are stories of soul retrievals happening and the whole village participates. It takes 3 days. People come from other villages, and, there's drumming and dancing and all of that. And so your entire community wants you healed. That's
Mm.
beautiful. Like that's, but we don't have that. We have like, Zoom.
Same thing.
So, so, so the fact that Dick and his collaborators, who need to be acknowledged, Michi Rose in particular, um, the fact that they discovered there was this thing called self
Mm.
that would show up if parts step back,
Mm.
that changes everything. As Dick, as I've heard him say, when he
Yeah.
discovered that, it was sort of like, oh shit, this changes everything. This is it, and it is, because self knows how to do that. And then you don't need a shaman or anybody else. Actually, you maybe need a therapist to hold the space for you and guide you through it,
Mm.
at least some of the time. But you could even develop the capacity to be in self and unburden your own parts.
Mm.
Um,
So,
and that's profound, and that's very appropriate for our time in history and for our whole idea of personality, because we all think we're somebody, right? We all have this idea of individualism,
mm.
um, and as long as that's there, you know, discovering that if we hook into something that's much bigger than any of our parts, profoundly and infinitely bigger than any of our parts, and that contains all the wisdom and love and compassion, all those qualities that, um, if you have access to that, then the healing can happen inside without drums and rattles, or you know um, or having to have a third person. Therapy used to be like that. It's sort of like you're in therapy long enough, and someone cares enough, or helps you have insight, then that's going to make the difference. But it doesn't work that way. It really doesn't. Um,
So, would you say that self then becomes like the shaman? Like back in the day, the shaman
hmm,
would be the mediator and would go into the spiritual world, and there was like one shaman for the village.
right.
And so, self is acting like that? Or is that?
But also, IFS therapists,
Okay.
uh, who have access to self and who have good parts detectors inside themselves and with others, can also serve that. And lots of times, I make the distinction between guides and guidance, and that if you do IFS therapy long enough and you start to get to know your guides and start to tune into that channel on the radio, then, and people, I think, do this spontaneously a lot without getting all spiritual about it. If there's a choice moment or a pause moment in IFS therapy, you could just go, what should I do? And a lot of times a little voice will say, just keep your mouth shut, or wait, or ask about this,
Mm.
or you'll get the next step in the protocol.
Yeah.
And I might go, is that okay? I'm checking to see if I get the next step of the protocol. I'm checking to see, is that like some IFS part of me that wants to get the healing done before the session's over? Or is
Mm-hmm.
that like really coming from self? It's the
Mm.
same thing, I think. And I would call that guidance, that you can rely on that sort of inner voice of guidance,
Mm.
if you're in there, and that, rather than needing a particular guide to guide you, there's a kind of intuitive knowing that IFS therapists gradually develop,
Mm.
that is, and I think it's probably aided by an interest in these sort of more, um, intuitive or spiritual aspects of IFS.
Mm.
But I don't think it's necessary. I think it just happens.
Yeah. So how do you know the difference? Like, how would you feel, or do you know the difference between that that feeling coming from self and that guidance and that sense of knowing, and like checking inside, asking my parts to give me space. My manager part that's like, let's get this ball rolling.
Right.
Asking those to give me space and being in self, and then like really like intuitively knowing to ask this or say this. How is that different than having a guide?
With the guide, you can have a conversation and you can see and feel
Okay.
a guide.
Mm.
Whereas what we're talking about is just being attuned enough to know during a pause, or not, not having a part agenda.
Mm.
And that's one of the ways to tell if it's a guide or a self-like part is
The
if
agenda.
if there's if there isn't a sense of there being an agenda, that this has to happen
And how you know the difference between self and guides is you actually experience the guide as you would a part.
as a being. Yeah, as a
Okay.
being. Yeah,
Instead of
they
self
are.
as go.
They're real. They're real. They're just as real as parts.
Mm.
Power animals, Jesus. Jesus is very commonly experienced by me and many others.
Mm. As a
Uh,
guide.
yeah, as a guide.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had Jesus show up to take burdens for
Mm.
people. People have a relationship and
Mhm.
have a, deep sense of Jesus. And it's a, that's a really great thing when that happens.
I
It's
think that was my
very,
other question for you, is the difference between, I think I emailed you that, the difference between a guide and like God. Like if I feel like God is telling me, like if I pass the tree, I might think like, oh, God is like whispering to me. Like if I hear like come sit next to me, I
right.
think, oh, that's God like leading me to do this, or that's God telling me to come sit next to the tree. Or if I have this sense of like, hey, you should walk this path and not this path, I often feel like that's God in me directing me. And
Yeah, that's very lovely.
would you say that that sometimes would be a guide or like a guide?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want to get into too much metaphysics
Yeah.
because there are all kinds of angels on the head of a pin kind of conversations that could be had about this. But
Right.
yeah,
I think that just it just feels really, honestly, I feel like I'm just really curious about it because um it's one of those things that keeps coming up, that it's like I've not thought about this part of IFS, you know what I mean?
uh-huh,
And then it's like, okay, I've learned this stuff of IFS and I've learned this stuff. Okay, and this all feels good. And then this guide, this
mm,
shamanism and guide question has come up probably over the past 2 or 3 months.
uh-huh.
And I'm like, okay,
Well, that's very timely. Yeah,
I know. I'm like, okay,
yeah.
yeah. And so I can use this
Yeah.
podcast to find out what I want to know about things.
Well, I wanted to thank you, actually. Meant to start out by just thanking
Aw.
you for sort of recognizing me. I've seen other, I've seen some of the other podcasts and seen the lineup, and they were all people I have a lot of respect for. And it's like great to be thought of as being someone who could be in that lineup. That's really very
Aw.
wonderful for
Aw.
me personally.
Well, I appreciate you
Um,
doing this.
yeah, yeah.
You have so much wisdom, and I'm excited that you're sharing it with me and with everybody else.
Hmm, well,
How do people find out about workshops and everything you're offering? Do you have a website?
I have a
How can
website, but it's really the same as yes, and I have a little shamanic organization called Center of the Circle. But
Perfect.
I haven't posted anything on that in probably 8 years or something like that. I share it with Karen Roberge, who used to do the teaching with me, and it's got a great name, but never been any news on that. Um, there is a mailing list people can join by going to that website.
Great. Okay.
Would
So
be
that's
an
what people should
option.
do. Okay.
Yeah.
And then you'll do an email.
Um,
Do you do like an email list blast or something like that?
I guess I haven't. I don't have. My managers don't like to get involved in that sort of thing,
Okay.
so I really never have organized that any sort of self promotion.
Mm,
I've sort of generally relied on organizations that had a list of some sort,
mm.
um, or otherwise. So I don't actually know. People can find my phone number. They can find my email address if they're
Okay,
interested in consultation. I would love to do individual consultation. If there was a group of people that wanted to get into that stuff, I
great,
would find a way to make time for that,
great. Okay,
uh, because that the more personal it is, the more intimate it is, the more connected it is, the better it is for everybody.
great. Well, will you
Um,
tell everybody your email right now just so they can write it down and
okay, it's EDWARD, Edward L. Yeats, Yeats, comes out as Edward Lee Eats at gmail.com.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
And all you have to do is Google me. You'll find my Psychology Today or my phone number. There's lots of places.
Great. Okay.
And that I love hearing people's voices. That's a great way to say hello.
Okay, so can we shift into,
IFS and Tibetan Buddhism.
yeah, let's do
Yeah.
that.
So right at the same in my in my shift from being a seeker to being a finder, when uh, I found IFS right around the same time as I found Tibetan Buddhism, and a particular teacher named Willa Miller, who is a lama in the Kagyu tradition. Um, I have been for many years in a study group, a psychotherapy and meditation study group that met
Oh,
once a week. A bunch of therapists back in the day when it was considered a little bit taboo to raise the issue of meditation with somebody,
wow.
um, to right through the whole mindfulness movement. And this is a group of pretty serious meditation practitioners.
Mm,
And through a series of what you might call synchronicities and guidance, I ended up getting to know Lama Willa and becoming involved with her, with the teachings that she and the tradition she represents. And that got me connected with Lama John McCransky, who has done several public events with Dick in the last couple of years. But what happened for me was that I had come to like get, and I'm not sure where it happened first. I think it might have happened first in IFS and IFS therapy, to recognize that there was this essence of mind that we call self,
mm,
and that has the capacity to heal everything. And as I started to really get to know the teachings from a Tibetan standpoint, they were both very shamanic and also uh, the what you might call the view of the mind is the same. It's really got great parallels. So there is this radiant inner Buddha nature that is described in the teachings, the Tibetan teachings in particular, um, that flavor of Buddhism. There are a lot of different flavors. And so it was sort of like, wow, this is it. This is the same thing. And so I started to tell Dick about the fact that was, you got to check this out, because he has some very well deserved and developed points of view on some of the downsides of meditation and practice and of Buddhism in particular, because there's a lot of Buddhism that is basically identifies what they call the afflictive emotions as problematic,
mm,
as like something to get rid of. And
Mm.
not only is that not possible, but it's not recommended.
Mm.
And in the tradition that I'm studying in Tibetan Buddhism, emotions are regarded as to be befriended.
Hmm.
And so the language is very similar. It's sort of like the idea is to be with them, befriend them, invite them to be there,
Mm.
not to try to get rid of them, just to relate to them and to regard feelings the same way. The feelings in general, all feelings, as just sort of arisings, manifestations of life, of the inner life. But what was missing was anything. What was missing was the idea that there is actually a sort of architecture to the personality.
Mm.
This whole idea that we have managers and firefighters and protected parts, and then we have vulnerable parts. So, like, if you're just dealing with feelings, that's very different
Mm.
from this idea of beings, parts
Mm.
as beings. Parts is actually subpersonalities is actually having their own existence,
Mm.
similar to the way you'd regard spirits as having their own existence.
Yeah.
And so I started having conversations with the lamas and with Dick about the sort of, oh, wow, there's some really interesting parallels here. I came up with 14 of them. One of them that's really important is this whole idea of turning toward the difficult,
Yeah.
um, which is counterintuitive. Mostly with stuff that hurts, we want to get away from it,
Mm.
do something about it, try to get rid of it, whatever.
Mm.
And both the Tibetan tradition and IFS have the same attitude, which is, no, that's a mistake. Actually,
Mm.
each problem is an opportunity for healing. Each
Mm.
problem is an opportunity to be brought onto the path and made part of your path,
Mm.
to be welcomed rather than rejected or ignored or any of
Right.
that.
Right.
So um, at this point, I would say I've studied it enough to be able to, I know the language, I know the practices, I know something about the lineage and the different teachers over the course of the last 2,000 years. Um, I've read the Tibetan Book of the Dead in depth with the teacher's help. So you know, I, I'm fairly well schooled enough to be able to talk with the lamas intelligently about the parallels, and also to talk with the IFS therapists intelligently about the parallels. So,
I love
um,
it, Ed, because it sounds like, you have really studied shamanism, you've really studied IFS, you've really studied and practiced and experienced, not just
yeah,
head, but right, you've done
yeah,
all three.
it's
So you have,
study
yeah,
means experience. Yeah,
yeah, definitely. And so it's like, wow, the gift that you give to all of these different mindsets or groups or communities, really, like you're able to give these gifts that only
yeah.
you could give. That's why you're on the circuit now.
Well, I think of myself sort of from a shamanic point of view, it'd be like bee medicine, It's
What
like
does that mean?
cross pollinating, taking the pollen from one flower and bring it to another flower. And,
Mm,
you know,
okay. Yeah.
that that's sort of what uh, I do experience it, have experienced it as a sort of spiritual assignment for this lifetime to be a go-between, a translator between these different traditions, and
Mm,
sort of turn them on to each other so that people can experience the richness of that, and also so the
mm,
traditions can learn from each other.
yeah.
Like, if the Buddhists would get it that there are parts, that what they're trying to do in meditation, they'd be able to do much easier, because
Mm,
they'd make friends with their parts, respect them properly, and they wouldn't get pulled out of meditation so much. That's one of the
Mm.
things that Dick was really emphasizing in his conversations with John McCransky.
Mm.
And similarly, in in Tibetan Buddhism, there are these marvelous archetypal guides like Kuan Yin or Tara and uh, the medicine Buddha and the Buddha himself. They're external, like the IFS is very sort of individualistic, but one of the practices in Tibetan Buddhism is to tune into a sort of projected or external visualized version of self, which which might be Jesus, or it might be the Buddha, or it might be this very popular Bodhisattva of compassion, Chenrezig. One of the practices that they do is to like accumulate lots of those and then to sort of receive love from them. And that activates and it helps that people get uh, recognize their essence, their self, because those are just externalized forms to evoke, I guess is the word.
Right, like they mirror it.
Yeah,
Okay, all right. So
right,
then they have these external images or and then that mirrors these different like almost like see the qualities of self.
right. That's right,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And if you look at the list of qualities of self, and then you look at the list of the qualities of Buddha nature, there are a lot of parallels between those two lists.
Mm.
Um, and and the idea over time in both traditions is gradually you identify less and less with your parts and your stories or whatever you want to call it. And
Okay.
you identify more and more with self or Buddha nature. And
Okay.
ultimately, everybody is regarded as a Buddha, just the way. And being an IFS therapist has been so educational that way, because, like, if I ever had any doubt about whether everybody's got this,
Mm.
all you got to do is do IFS therapy for a while and help people get their parts to step back.
Mm-hmm.
And all of a sudden, there they are.
Mm.
There's that essence that can be curious and caring and want to help their little ones inside.
Mm. Mm.
And
Mm.
that's been a great, for me, that's been a great sort of confirmation of the reality that this is actually true
Mm.
about us. Um,
Yeah.
you know, it,
Mm.
it's also true though that we all have parts, and you got to have parts.
So that's what so I heard Dick say something about spiritual bypassing and that's
Yeah,
one of the things that he feels like meditation does or
right.
or it can do. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, what that means?
Yeah. I think people who have meditated for a long time will experience states of peace and joy and delight. Um, and sometimes they'll develop their management system will get good at bringing them back to that kind of state. Um, and I've seen that with clients sometimes, spiritually oriented clients will be right at the point of the pain starting. And all of a sudden, things will just brighten up and feel healed. And that's the self like part, just kind of like in the case I'm thinking of, just self like part, just helping out by brightening things up with the
Mm.
certain knowledge that the pain in there is not going to be appreciated or recognized. So
Mm.
we
Mhm.
might as well just pretend like everything's fine, you know. And
Oh, I
that
have a part that's very much like that. That works really well.
yeah, it does work really well, but it also works really well to recognize and love those parts
Mm.
that do
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
and to let them know they don't have to here. Like, we can really handle whatever the pain is.
Yeah.
But
And so that's what meditation, I think that's what you mean when you say that, like, that in meditation, not recognizing feelings, like by not recognizing that feelings are parts, if I'm meditating and then all of a sudden I feel anger or I hear an angry story, I can recognize that's a part and I don't push it aside. I actually kind of lean into that part. I
it
listen
can.
to it, I friend it, or ask it for space so that I could
That's
just be
right.
here right now and just let me
Exactly.
be in the
So
sunshine or whatever that is, and then I can attend to it later. But I'm not just,
you gotta you gotta make good on that promise. But if you
yeah,
do,
yeah,
then they'll trust you, and they will be patient and wait.
yeah. And that reminds me of a tuning into like the radio station, that it's like the more I ignore my parts, the more kind of havoc I think that they're gonna,
Have
the
to.
more firefighter behavior I probably will
Yeah.
do, the more I ignore them. But the more I'm attuning with them, there's more of a flow and
Right.
more of a conversation and more of a, if I'm meditating or I'm sitting in the sun and all of a sudden I have a list of things I need to do, there's more of a flow of like, hey, I see you, manager, and give me a little bit of space. And when we go inside, we'll write a list or whatever. And then that there's more of a flow there because I'm attuning. There's more of that attuning into that radio station.
Right. I will have that sometimes where I want to sit down and meditate and I can't stop thinking about all the things I need to do. And I'll make a deal, sort of like, okay, well, why don't we just like stop and make a list and make a list, and then I can sit down and meditate. I don't have to think about the stuff that's on the list because I know it's there and I'll go back to it later.
Yeah,
And that manager is satisfied enough with that. That's fine,
yeah, yeah,
And then I can sit and in relative peace.
yeah. I've actually asked managers to like, I'm like, so I have managers that worry that I'm going to forget. So they have to
Right.
keep reminding me.
Yeah.
So I'll say, you have a really good memory, and I trust you that you're going to remember and not let me forget.
Uh-huh.
And that seems to work.
That that sounds like a good thing for me to try.
So in Buddhism, though, would they, the typical thing would be that they would just ignore that and kind of hop over it and go towards
Well,
the
I think each person has their own path, so there's a lot of variation. Um, I remember John McCransky saying, usually when people are talking about spiritual bypassing, they're talking about somebody else. And then he went on to say some like disarmingly honest thing about himself
I
and how
love
long
that.
he's practiced and all of that. I do think that um, it helps to have a sort of conceptual infrastructure, which Tibetan Buddhism does have, that like kind of points to, wait a minute, we need to welcome everything, literally everything, including
Mm,
death. We need to be able to open to and welcome everything. That's
mm,
the path. And that is the mind training that runs through all the schools of Tibetan Buddhism. Is called Lojong, that holds that point of view. Whereas there are other Buddhist traditions that are less transformation oriented. They're more like let's reach nirvana, or let's get rid of the bad stuff. So a lot of it's based, I think, on let's keep the monks in line. We need to have a lot of rules and regulations to keep the monks in line, to keep them celibate, to keep them, all of that. And
mm,
that's, I think, less true in the tradition, in the Tibetan tradition, but depends on when and where and who
mm.
too. So I think it's very personal.
Yeah, and I heard Dick say that one of the cruelest, so you're talking about meditation or like a mindfulness meditation, that
Yeah.
one of the cruelest things we could do is see a being or our parts in agony and not help them by like bypassing them or ignoring them and just doing like a mindfulness exercise, that actually was one of the cruelest things we could do. And I was like, that's fascinating.
Yeah, I think he's got a part that feels very strongly about that. And I don't blame him. I have the same part. I can get very worked up
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
I think there are much crueler things than that. But it's a really great point that if you regard them as beings, then you can't dismiss them. If you just think of them as thoughts and feelings, then they can sort of be, oh, well, let's just label them and dismiss them. Drop the story. People
Right.
in spiritual traditions are constantly saying, drop the story, because they've had some experience of perspective and they recognize that each of these individual stories doesn't really amount to much. If you've got multiple lifetimes, what happened with this particular mother or father or this particular 4-year-old is in some sense not a big deal. But it's a really big deal if your 4-year-old is stuck in the past and you've got a whole bunch of stuff that you have to do in order to keep that 4-year-old sequestered there.
Right. Right.
So they're very different perspectives.
Well,
One,
go ahead, I'm sorry.
One is really a profound sort of geological time perspective. And the other has to do with like, what are we going to do here and now in order to show up and be well? I think it's important to appreciate both perspectives, both of those orientations.
And they both can help each other. Maybe
Right.
part of that
really
is if I'm, if I'm here multiple lives, if that's something that you believe in, that, and then that's probably I'm supposed to be learning something or whatever. Maybe part of that, going back to that 4-year-old and doing that work, is part of what I'm supposed to be doing here.
Yeah. Yeah, if you do IFS therapy long enough, you're going to run into past life parts.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that?
Oh, that's all I need to say right now.
Oh my gosh. I feel like you have to say more than that. That's a big thing to say.
Well, that's what
There's
we
parts
do,
of me that
though, is we
completely
just
freak out
follow.
about that.
We have no idea what we're going to find, and we just follow what the truth is in there, whatever it is. And we need to be open to whatever it is and drop any, if we have beliefs of our own parts, that means we have parts that are attached to some idea of how things are.
Right.
And that could get in the way. That could really get in the way of someone's past life parts being able to show up.
Yeah, I could see that. Like if I didn't believe in past lives, and then and I was just inquiring, and the patient's part was just telling me, and I was just asking, like I would normally do, like you asking, because I have no idea, so you're asking, and then if they start, one of my level 1 training, so my level 1 training, one of the other participants had a ton of past life stuff, and I was completely like freaked out by it. But it was like, it was her story. I have no idea. There are parts of me that have some beliefs about that, but I don't know. And it was like the first weekend of the practice groups, and she was the client.
Yeah.
And it was like, what am I getting into?
Yes.
Oh my.
Yeah.
Yeah. But just ask. And I think that's true, that like how often our beliefs could potentially interfere, whether it's with guides or asking about power animals or asking about.
Yeah, or sexual abuse too. Like, you might have a client and there might be a part of you that knows a lot about eating disorders and sexual abuse, say, that just kind of assumes there must be sexual abuse in there. And that, and then you could go looking for it. But one of the things that we don't do in IFS is we don't go looking for stuff. We just ask and let stuff just show up. And, that saves us from this whole controversy around memories, because we don't have some preconceived idea about what we're going to find. A lot of times that'll happen to me. I'll think, oh, I know what's going to be in there. And then when it comes up, it's completely different. I never would have guessed in a million years. But it's totally real. It's totally, I just at this point have long since given up on having it come out the way I think it is supposed to come out, because just, life just doesn't come out the way you think it's supposed to come out, period. Inside, outside, all around the town, doesn't matter.
I love that. I think that's true. Right. And so when I was just thinking about finding that book in your Jeep, and that idea of like that led you on this beautiful path, and you would have never thought or planned or anticipated that happening, and you just let that unfold. And if that class wasn't canceled, you wouldn't have had the conversation. It's so interesting.
How the hell did all that happen?
Yeah. Or gone to the potty at the same time that Dick did and had this conversation.
Yeah.
I remember one time I'd already done my level 1, and I was taking a workshop down in Watertown, and I walked out of a classroom into the hallway, and other people were still talking in the classroom. And I walked out of the classroom, and Dick was standing in the hallway. And it was just me and Dick in the hallway. And I was like, hi. And I remember thinking, I've got like a minute. What do I say? What do I do?
Right.
And I was like, I think I said, what are you doing here? I said, what are you doing here? Oh my gosh. And he was like teaching a level 2 or something. And then all of a sudden, all these people came out, and poor Dick got like bombarded, and I just walked away. And I was like, really? That's what you said? What are you doing here? I have to come up with something better the next time I see him by himself.
Well, that happens to me. I have parts after I encounter a big shot. Often there are multiple reviews.
Reviews.
Of what I could have said, what I could have, should have said, and what they said, and what it meant, and did it mean they liked me or not, and all that.
Yes, my gosh, it's exhausting.
Such a pain in the ass.
Yes.
I think it's one of the reasons that I've tried to stay so low profile. Because that's all of that stuff is just tiresome.
It is exhausting. Yeah. And I think I was going to say, like, just going to those parts when they get that way, because I definitely have that, like, why didn't this person do that? And then I just like spin and spin and spin. And it's like just going to those parts and just being with them. They're young and feel afraid and feel unloved, I think. For me, I think that's part of it, is not being seen and feeling unloved. So if this person said this or then it's like those parts feel unseen. I think that's why they start flipping out. When they feel seen by me, then they quiet.
It's amazing how quickly they calm down.
I know. Well, that's the thing that's so interesting, is that idea. If I go to them, they calm down. We're talking 5 minutes. If I don't go to them and I'm eating all the cookies, we're talking 2 weeks. And a lot of cookies.
Yes.
Well, Ed, this was great.
I just want to, I was going to, right before you started to say that, I was thinking, I've just been so comfortable in this conversation. You're just really good at this. You really.
Oh, thanks, Ed.
So good at drawing out the story and being responsive to what I'm saying, and I just feel very connected.
Oh, good.
I really just feel very grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thanks for hanging out today. If you liked this episode, make sure you subscribe. And if you really like this episode, share it with a friend and leave a review. You can follow me on Instagram at IFS Tammy. and join our community on Facebook at the One Inside Podcast. Talk to you next time.
Today's episode was sponsored by Brighter Vision. What's the point of having a beautiful website if it doesn't attract the clients you want to see? As the worldwide leaders of website design for therapists, Brighter Vision sees this issue happen way too often. A nice-looking website doesn't equate to a successful website. The truth is, your current website might even be turning off potential clients. That's where Brighter Vision comes in. Brighter Vision's team of website designers will create a website that is centered around attracting and retaining your ideal client so that you can have a nice-looking website as well as a successful one. Better yet, Brighter Vision is offering $100 off exclusively for listeners of the One Inside podcast. To take advantage of this offer, simply go to brightervision.com/inside. Again, that's brightervision.com/inside.